Hey guys, Mike Lukic here. Thanks for watching my video and welcome back to my series on how to use GTO Plus. If you haven't already, I'd recommend that you take a look at the first two parts of the series where I talked about how to actually set up a tree and a solve in the first place in part one, and then actually how to interpret the output in part two. Today I'm going to get into a little bit more around manipulating trees through either editing the trees themselves or actually node locking in the tree. Uh, Typically, at least when I see others using solvers, a lot of times they stop after the steps that we talked about in part two. They build their trees, they run their simulations, and they take a look at the output to either confirm plays that they've made or to get a sense for the quote unquote correct strategy for how they should be playing a hand. But that really doesn't it doesn't benefit us to actually do it in that way because we're not necessarily playing opponents who are playing equilibrium strategies. We're playing opponents who are deviating significantly from those equilibrium strategies, sometimes trying to exploit us, and sometimes just because they have leaks in their own game. So, in order for us to utilize solvers to actually build strategies to best exploit those players and actually build strategies in which we can maximize our expectation in game, we need to be making much more precise assumptions and testing a lot more about the different actions that our opponents may be taking in a hand. So that's what I'm going to be covering during this video. I'm going to be spending time changing different parts of the game tree, whether it's the actual structure of the tree itself or node locking individual decision points, to see how those outputs vary and show, at least from a conceptual standpoint, how we can use GTO Plus to help develop those exploitative strategies. So without further ado, let's jump right into the tool. So I've built a really simple tree here to just start demonstrating the example for how we might edit trees and how we might start node locking trees. Let me start by saying that this configuration is definitely not how I would be designing a tree in the first place, but I think it does demonstrate the point effectively of how we can start with something fairly basic and how we can customize things a little bit within the tool to build a more accurate tree that might model an in-game scenario a little bit better. So as you can see here, I started with a pot size of 7.5 big blinds. We open in a middle position. This is our range to 3.5 big blinds. To 3 big blinds. We are called by a button range right here, and both of our blinds fold. And the flop is a rainbow 8-7 deuce. So we have 7.5 big blind starting pots. Effective stacks are 100 big blinds, and I just left the defaults of 75% pot bets for everything. And what we see, and I ran the solution, and what we see here is that our out of position range has about 47% equity, and as a result of us having being at an equity disadvantage against our opponent, not necessarily having a nut advantage, given that both of us have 8s, 7s, deuces, and 8-7 suited, and the fact that we're out of position, we are checking a significant portion of our range, just about 94% of our range here. Now, what I want to do is first show how we can actually edit the tree using the tree editor to maybe make a little bit more of a realistic example of what the actual betting options might look like. Because what we typically won't see is just both us and our opponents firing 75% pot bets the entire time, we're probably going to see a little bit more nuance there, and maybe some smaller bet sizes, some larger bet sizes. We also want to potentially give the solver more options. If the solver has more options, we may see the ability to be betting more of our range. We may see the solver choose different things, and we may be able to generate more insights as a result of this. So when we do the betting, when we do build our tree, we clearly can use this to get a little bit more sophisticated and use custom settings for flops and turns and rivers. And that is useful and helpful for us to be able to build out a detailed tree. But we can also actually edit the tree when it's already built using the tree editor. And we can do that by actually opening our tree editor, which is up here. And actually, sorry, that's a navigation of the tree. We can actually open the tree editor, which is right here. And by clicking edit tree, we're going to first import our tree, and that imports what our current tree looks like. So let's just take a look at the tree, and let's actually edit our decisions, and we can try to be a little realistic as to what might actually happen on the flop. And I'm actually going to start with this first node here to determine what different strategic options we actually want to give ourselves and in building this tree. What you're going to see when you hover over this, you're going to see the specific details of the different nodes. And you're going to see we have the option to either bet 5.63, which is 75% of the pot, or check, which is the other option here. And it gives us our pot size, our stack size, etc. You'll see that under each of those decision points, there's a 225 MBs and 467 MBs next to bet and check, respectively. That's the size of that node of the tree. So the betting portion of the tree is 225 megabytes, and the checking portion of the tree is 467 megabytes. The general rule of thumb is that as we trend earlier in the game tree, you're going to see that number being larger, meaning that giving the solver more options on the flop is going to amplify throughout the rest of the hand, because there are just so many more decision nodes on turns and rivers. But by adding one or two extra options on the flop, we make the rest of the tree much bigger. So what we can do to actually be smart about things is we can start adjusting the tree a little bit here to actually model a realistic scenario, because a lot of times we also don't see scenarios where we check, there's a bet, we check raise, they re-raise, we re-raise. That doesn't necessarily happen that often, so we can remove some of these decision points or change some of these decision points to just give this a more realistic feel as to what a board or what a game situation might look like within the solver itself. So to edit any tree or node, what we can do is first just left click on this decision node, and that brings up this drop down. And within this drop down, we have some options here. So this is the actual tree configuration that's currently built, and we can do a few things. We can first either delete any of these just by hitting the X. We can also add actions by actually adding some bet sizes here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm not going to actually delete any of those. I mean, I can show you quickly by just deleting the check, and I could just force my range to just bet everything, which is certainly something that we could do, but we don't want to do. Maybe we want to do this in spots where we are analyzing a situation where we're going to bet 100% of our range. That's okay, but this is definitely not one of those. So I'm going to add the check size, which is just adding a bet of 0. Whenever you add something here, we can change the configuration of the tree afterwards. So we can either follow things by the current tree, we can follow them by different settings or different profiles we have set up. I'm just going to follow this by current advanced settings, which is going to be the same thing as the current tree that we've actually set up. I'm going to leave this 75% bet size, but I'm actually also going to give this a small 1/3 pot bet size. And excuse me, that was... There we go. So I have a 1/3 pot bet size, and again, you similar to what I just showed you there is if I actually add the action and do this in terms of just a value, not percentage, it's going to enter the value here in terms of number of chips or number of big blinds. If I want to actually just make this in terms of a percentage of the pot, I actually just have to put in a percentage there and change that there. So now I have two bet sizes, a 75% large bet size and a 33% small bet size, and I'm going to actually use the current advanced settings. Other things I can do here is I could use this basic play, which is geometric bet sizing, which really just changes the size of the bets to essentially get the money in smoothly based off of the number of bets in the pot. So 3x means that it's going to try to get all 100 big blinds in the pot over the course of 3 bets. 4x means it's going to do that over the course of 4 bets. 5 means over the course of 5 bets, etc. And you see the percentages change accordingly. So not surprisingly, if it's over 6 bets, you need to bet less if you're going to get the money in over the course of 6 bets. But if you want to get the money over the course of 1 bet, you're going to have to bet a very significant portion of the overall pot. I don't typically choose that often. A lot of times I end up using the current advanced settings, but really you have different options in terms of how you actually want to construct that. And when I hit accept, what you'll see here is now my tree has changed, and now I have a second option here. And those settings, what those settings represent are how the rest of the tree afterwards is built. Now, I've added complexity. I haven't reduced any complexity here, and that's typically not what we really want to do in this spot. So let's say maybe that we decide that we actually want to simplify things further. Now we have given ourselves 2 betting options. Let's suppose that we have decided that if our opponents raise us, we are just going to either jam all in or call or fold. So in that case there, we bet our opponents raised us. We can change these to get rid of this raise size and then add a raise size to jam everything. Sorry, excuse me. I will just... So a good rule of thumb here is if you just kind of enter a very large raise size, what it'll do is it'll just give us an all-in there. I chose 80, which it actually is 80.31. So if I just choose a super large raise size, it's just going to jam instead. And once I accept that, it's going to actually just change the tree here, and it cuts it off to basically say, I either have the option to raise all in or fold. In the smaller bet size here, if our opponent raises, because our opponent here, if we go back to the tree, our opponent had a bit of an equity advantage here. If our opponent raises us, we're just going to get rid of our raise size, and we're only going to have a call or a fold. And then on check, if we check and our opponent bets, we're not going to put a check raise range in place. We're just going to check call or check fold. Not saying this is actually realistic. We probably don't want to do this in this particular example. We may want to actually have a check raise range here in this spot. But what you can actually see is while we did add a bet size and we did add complexity to the tree, you'll actually, if you add up those that sizing, the megabytes, the 207, 207, and 383 megabytes, it's going to be larger in this tree than it was on the previous version of the tree. We did simplify things considerably by changing some of the strategic options on the flop. We could continue moving to the turns and rivers if we want to. So we can click on any one of these arrows, and what those arrows represent are calls in which it takes us to a turn. So by hitting any one of those buttons, it takes us to the turn, and now we can have our own separate tree on the turn, and we can do and so on and so forth to the river. So as you can see, you can get fairly complicated here and actually edit your entire tree from turn and river. But what you have to recognize is that by editing this triangle or this arrow right here, it only edits this node of the spot where we bet large and they call. It would not change spots where, so for instance, we bet small and they call, or we bet small, they raise, we call, etc. So if you want to change your turns in this spot here, you're actually going to have to go and do so in every single one of these spots. But this is a pretty good way of actually diving in and really customizing what your tree looks like in terms of bet sizes to try to, one, be realistic from a standpoint of how you and your opponent's gameplay might actually work from a practicality standpoint, but more specifically, what it's helpful for is letting yourself get much more customized while at the same time managing this memory needed for solving, which this 797, that's just going to be those three numbers summed together. So by keeping this number smaller, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to keep the tree less complex, and you're going to just allow a simpler tree for quicker processing and getting to a solution faster. When you get to a point, and there's also a couple other options here. So you can either remove all your bets out of position if you wanted to, or you can actually edit your action colors. So in this spot here, we have specific actions, and this is how it shows up on the editor. You can actually change these action colors, and all of these are in the RGB codes. You can change some of these, and I'll just put in 0, 0, 0. And you'll see the code just turns into black. So I don't know all of the RGB codes off the top of my head, but if you want to change some of those codes and make things look visually appealing, if you like, you can do that as well too. So I'll just cancel that, and when you're finally done with those, with your changes, you can accept the changes and hit confirm. And what you see is you'll go back to your tree, and now the tree is adjusted to have our different betting options. But you'll notice now that we're back at different frequencies. The tree resets, and you actually have to go resolve the tree. So I'm going to resolve the tree, and we're going to take a look at what the output looks like. And from there, we're going to get into how do we actually node lock to customize the tree within the actual tree output. So let's run this, and we're going to run the solver, and we'll be back in a minute. All right, so we have our output, and things didn't change that significantly. I mean, it still has this. The solver still does prefer this larger bet size over the smaller bet size, and it prefers a check more often in this case here. So the output is not significantly different, but what this does show us is what I do want to go through during the rest of this video is how we can actually adjust different assumptions about our ranges and our opponent's ranges to see how the solver changes, the output changes based off of what we actually input. Too often, and I mentioned this up at the top of the video, too often I see opponents, or I see people use solvers, and suppose they were actually looking at this exact scenario, and they use solvers, and their first assumption is, I should just be checking the majority of our range here. And that's not necessarily a bad assumption. I want to say that in a vacuum, that is not a bad assumption, but it's an incomplete assumption. And the reason being is that this output does not represent the best way in which we should be playing this hand. What this output represents is the way in equilibrium, in an equilibrium environment, the way a person would play a strategy that would not be able to be exploited by their opponent. It's two computers which are clairvoyant to one another, each other's strategies, playing against each other, and this is the output that is generated. So that's a lot of jargon, and it sounds really, really complicated. But to simplify things considerably, if you knew your opponent's exact strategy and your opponent knew your exact strategy, this would be the way you could play so that your opponent couldn't do anything about what it is that you were doing. However, your opponent is not going to be playing this exact way. Conversely, actually, your opponent is, in actuality, your opponent is actually going to be playing much differently than, is very likely to be playing much differently than the optimal, or quote unquote optimal, or the equilibrium strategy that player two does in this case. Your opponent is going to be deviating from that strategy. Sometimes they're going to be deviating from that strategy because they are trying to exploit you, and based on assumptions that they are making. But most often, many cases, they are going to be deviating from that strategy because they have a leak in their game, and maybe they are playing suboptimally themselves. Either way, we want to change our strategy so that we can maximize our expectation against their specific strategy. And we're not going to necessarily be able to understand that by building out, by following this equilibrium output specifically. So I want to go through the ways in which we can actually node lock to help us develop those exploitative strategies. The first thing that we can do here is, a lot of times what I'll do here is look at how my opponent is responding to my strategies and make assumptions based off of what I actually think that they would do in game. So what we can look at here is that we can ignore this small bet size in this case here because it's such a smaller portion of the game tree, and just really look at the larger bet size in this case here in this spot. So when we bet larger here, our opponent here at equilibrium is raising 75% pot 14% of the time, they're calling 57% of the time, and they're folding 29% of the time. And we can see kind of the mix of hands in which they actually do this with. But suppose that's not necessarily how our opponent actually will behave. So do we think our opponent will be calling with some of these low pair hands? Do we think they're going to be raising with some of these overcard hands as well too? Maybe not. But one way in which we can actually start testing the sensitivity of this is by node locking and seeing how our optimal strategy should adjust based off of an opponent who does things perhaps a little bit differently. So we have these buttons down here at the bottom of the screen. We have this analysis mode, which is no edits, and that's how we are typically just navigating and looking at this tree. Or we can hit this other button, which is lock and edit the decision. And when we do that, we'll see the lock button, this lock icon show up on all of these hands, as well as up at the top of the screen. Now, what we can do here now is we can start changing some of our opponent's outputs and adjusting the strategy to lock how we think our opponent is going to respond. So let's just try to build quickly how we think our opponent may respond to something like this, and just an average typical player in a player pool. We can do so a few ways. First, we can use these buttons to make sure that the current selection is what we want. And I'm actually going to start. One thing I like to do here is just start by just setting a baseline. So I click fold, and you can see this current selection is fold. Now, a quick way to just set all of these to a certain value is just put your mouse in the middle, click on the middle here, drag everything to the left, and then drag everything to the right. And now what we see is we've set everything to fold. Now, that's obviously not going to be the case. Our opponent's not going to fold everything. So but we set this as a baseline, and we want to at least set a minimum of what hands is our opponent going to continue with and what hands are they going to be folding. So before actually getting to the raises, I'm just going to start with calls. So what hands are my opponent going to fold, and versus what hands are my opponents going to call or raise? Now, we can do so a few ways. So we can, one, just click on the individual hands. So we'll start with the obvious ones, our sets, 8s, 7s, and deuces. They're going to continue with. Our 2 pairs, they're going to continue with. All of the over pairs, they're going to continue with. And then the top pairs. And the other thing we can do here is we can hover over the right-hand side of the screen and just highlight and drag across. Let's say they're also going to do so with middle pairs. They're always going to continue with a middle pair. And then finally, we're going to say that they are always going to continue with their straight draws. So their open-ended straight draws and their gut shots here in this spot. So we have spot hands that they're always going to continue with here. We're also going to have hands that they may continue with sometimes, or they may fold sometimes. So a good way of doing this is you go back down to this current selection, and if you double click on it, it's going to bring up this distribution here, where you can actually mix if you want here too. And I think mixing is a great way. We covered this in the first video of setting up trees, but mixing is a great way to introduce that level of uncertainty that we have in what we think our opponent may or may not do. So some opponents might raise or call, and some opponents might fold, or they might do so different portions of the time. But a lot of times I like to mix things 50-50, or if they're leaning one way or the other, I might mix things 75-25 one way or the other. But to simplify things, let's just say that our opponent is going to have these under pairs. We'll just say 3s, 4s, and 5s. They're going to call half the time and fold half the time. And then 6s, they'll just call all the time. The other hands that they might be doing so with half the time and folding half the time might be these overcards with backdoor flush draws. So we're going to lock this, and you can remember if you can kind of right click on this, and now we've locked this as to 2-card backdoor flush draws. So if you notice here, if you hover over here, even though our opponent has all of the ace-jack suiteds, it's not showing the ace-jack suited of diamonds or ace-10 suited of diamonds or any of the ones that did not have the backdoor flush draw, which is useful for us because when we're node locking, we can actually only change the ones that fit this criteria. So what I'm going to do here in this spot here is I'm going to say that our opponent is always going to continue with the ace-high backdoor flush draws, and then they are going to continue 50% of the time with the king-high backdoor flush draws, and then they're always going to be folding the queen-high backdoor flush draws. Again, may or may not be realistic, but we can actually see that. And then when I unclick the filter, you can actually see that we are continuing with the ace-high backdoor flush draws all the time, and then when we hover over the king-high ones, we are continuing with that, the backdoor flush draws 50% of the time and folding the other 50% of the time, but always folding the king-high king X suiteds without the backdoor flush draw. Finally, let's just also give our opponent half of their ace queens, and I think that's probably decent for now. The last thing we want to do is we're going to bring in some raises here into the mix. And similar to this, we can say that they're going to be raising hands all the time or sometimes. So let's just say that our opponent will always raise deuces and 7s and 8s. And it really doesn't matter what we actually do here because this is more for demonstration purposes, but maybe 50% of the time they're raising their 2 pairs, 50% of the time they're raising their over pairs, and then they're going to be raising 50% of the time their flush draw. Their straight draws that also to go along with this as well too. So we have ranges here where our opponent is. We feel pretty comfortable with this. We end up building out a solution here where our opponent's going to have some raises, some calls, and some folds. Now, again, what we're going to see here is the rest of the strategy stays the same. So the rest of this is all unlocked, but we've locked this one particular node. And we can actually rerun the solver to see how things change with that one input locked considerably. So what the solution or what the solver is actually going to do is it's now going to find a solution with all other nodes unlocked and chained, but keeping this response from our opponent locked. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run the solver, and we're going to just take a look at how changing one thing here can really drastically impact the rest of the overall solve. All right, so we have our output, and as you see, the solution has changed significantly. So based on node locking our opponent here, what we've done here is, and we actually haven't changed the raise frequency that much, and we actually have our opponent raising a little bit more frequently. But what we have done is now they are calling much less frequently, and then they're folding a lot more frequently. And that's changed our frequency to, instead of now betting only 4% of the time, now we are virtually betting 100% of our range. And our EV has gone up accordingly. Now, it doesn't seem like we've really changed that much about what our opponent's doing, but we have, and by locking our opponent's strategy in a certain way, what we can see is just how drastically the output might change based on one specific type of opponent. So we might be able to make some broad sweeping conclusions here by saying, if our opponent is the type of opponent to overfold on this flop, particularly just take a look at playing a little bit more of a fit or fold strategy of, we have overcards, we really just whiff this board. We're not going to necessarily try to float in position, even if we do have hands like ace highs or hands with backdoor flush draws and some potential backdoor straight draws. That opens our strategy up to have the ability to start betting everything. And when our opponent does play back against us, whether that's through a raise or through a call, so if it's through a raise, we can now really shed a majority of our range here in this spot. And if they play through a call, we can really only continue on these really good turn cards. When we see a lot of very poor turn cards, we can start shutting down a lot of our range as well too. And it shows us just the value of the node locking here, because now a lot of these hands, which either were check folds at the beginning, or hands that we had to put into checking range to protect our overall checking range, now can turn into bets, because some of these weaker hands in our range can actually benefit from just getting our opponent to fold right away and shutting down and shedding later on later streets. So this is just one example here, but it's an example to show how node locking can change the output considerably. So when should you node lock, and how much should you actually node lock? I actually think you should be node locking virtually every single time that you're running solves, and because node locking is going to be able to give you much more realistic senses of how you should be adjusting your strategy based off of different types of opponents. But the other thing I think that's super important is to just continually adjust your assumptions and through different types of node locks. So after looking at this output, the next thing I might do is actually start trying to build out scenarios in which my opponent may be calling too much, or scenarios in which my opponents might be calling but not necessarily raising that much, or scenarios where my opponents are raising too much. So by doing this different times, I can start trying to develop different strategies that I might employ against different types of opponents. In this particular case, I'm going to be betting a lot against opponents who are playing fit or fold here in this spot, because I'm able to do so profitably. I may not be able to do that against opponents who call too much. I may not be able to do that against opponents who raise too much. I may have to have different strategies, and the solver is going to help me derive the outputs based off of that. The important thing here is not any one particular output. The important thing is, as I change inputs into the model, understanding what how the outputs vary and how the outputs change as a result of that. And those adjustments are going to be the insights that I'm going to utilize to help build my own strategy and help develop my own intuition at the table. The other question I get a lot is how much of the tree should I node block? And I don't think there's a really great answer to that. I could node lock everything on the street. I could not node lock only certain things on the street. I think a few general rules of thumb I like to give are: one, I don't necessarily like to run node locks across multiple streets, and the reason being is that you have to be very, very specific about node locking on specific runouts, turns, and rivers, and it becomes challenging to keep those assumptions across multiple streets throughout the course of a hand. So it makes it challenging to actually get an output that you can actually do something with by node locking across multiple streets. It's not saying you can't do it, but it just becomes a little bit more challenging. The other thing I guess I would say is the answer kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So if you take a look at one of the other videos that I've posted, which is how to actually use a solver to study, I go through a process in which I start by node locking everything, and then I run everything at equilibrium, and then I node lock my strategy, and then I also just run something where I node lock my opponent's strategy. And all of those are designed very, very specifically to answer one specific question. So if I node lock my opponent's strategy, what that's going to help tell me is, well, what's the maximum exploit against what I assume to be my opponent's strategy? If I node lock only my strategy, then the solution is going to tell me, well, what's the maximum exploit against my own strategy? So, and then if I try to node lock everything on the street, it's going to help try to model the output of what something might look like from an EV standpoint if I am playing against my opponent and all of my assumptions are accurate. So am I able to accurately take advantage of my opponent? Is my strategy effective against my opponent from an EV standpoint? I can compare that to just equilibrium or other different node locks to see how far am I off from the amount of money that I actually could be earning on those specific spots. So I hope this was helpful. There's a lot of things that you can actually do from a node locking perspective, and definitely take a look at my how to use a solver video for study. What I really wanted to cover in here is just the mechanics of how do you actually node lock within a particular board, and how can you actually implement things. I hope I conveyed that in this. If you want to just take off the node lock actually, and you want to actually just run equilibrium, you can just right click on this again, and you can right click back and forth, and that can lock and unlock decisions. But if you just want to actually go back to equilibrium, you could just right click on that and then run the solve again, and it's actually going to go back to an equilibrium environment too. So but hopefully this video was helpful. Hopefully it demonstrated just the functionality of node locking and how you can actually utilize this to change some of those inputs to really take advantage of understanding how some of those slight changes can really impact what the outputs of the solver are. And hopefully that helps inform your own strategy and inform just your different understanding of how things that your opponents do may adjust some of the things, the best ways in which we can actually counter those. So again, hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you're looking at this on YouTube, definitely hit the subscribe button on my YouTube to be aware of when any new videos come out. If you're looking at this on YouTube, take a look at my website, lucas.io. I have a lot of really cool stuff up there, whether it be long-form analyses. I have some products up there. I'm doing a lot of work just around the data space in poker, so definitely take a look at that site. If you're on the site itself too, you're going to see. You can take a look at my YouTube channel. I try to put out videos periodically, whether it be how-to videos, whether it be analysis videos, etc. And I'll be back in the next couple weeks with the final part of this series, where what I'm going to go through is just some more advanced tips. I'm going to go through the database modes, and I'm going to just wrap up the GTO Plus series and potentially start diving into a similar series for PO Solver after that. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.